Welcome to Part 2, Chapter 6. In this chapter, we're starting to move into some advanced topics in contracts. You'll be relying on the foundational discussion we had regarding contracts in Chapter 2. Now, you may recall that in Chapter 2 I said in most cases your formal contractual arrangements will not be with guests. Well, convention contracts are absolutely an exception to that rule. In this chapter, we will be dealing with express written contracts that are bilateral or two-sided with our guests. The reasons we use formal contracts in this situation should be clear to you once you finish reading this chapter. The bottom line is that the stakes are just too high to treat this situation any other way. Remember, when analyzing contracts, we normally start with a review of the elements to see whether we have a binding and enforceable legal agreement. While that review is still necessary, in most cases, we're going to be more concerned with the consequences of a breach of these agreements because they are so explicit in their making. The competencies for Chapter 6 include a review of the major topics that should be covered in convention contracts, the way some hospitality organizations attempt to predict the future when negotiating these contracts, some insurance that a hotel might advise or even require convention groups to carry, and finally, when periodic reviews of this particular type of agreement should be done. I think it's important for you to understand the type of document we'll be covering today. To that end, before you watch the rest of this lecture, I'd like you to pause the video and take a minute to review the sample contract in your textbook. Once you have finished reviewing this document, as well as the suggested protection clauses and other elements contained at the end, come back and finish this video. So I'll assume that you've reviewed that information at this point, but before we move on, I want to point something out. In most cases, this kind of contract is going to be drafted by a legal professional as opposed to you as a hospitality manager. All of the clauses are there for a reason. While they might not seem important to you, rest assured that they have been hard fought and negotiated in the past, and they are to protect either your company or your guests, as well as to attempt to prevent misunderstandings. Now that you're familiar with the contract form, let's move on to our first competency, the major items that should be included in a convention contract. When you're thinking about major items we're going to include, remember that this is a bilateral contract. A bilateral contract is one in which we exchange a promise for a promise. In this case, what we're really talking about is a whole host of promises in exchange for a similarly long list from the group we're dealing with. The important point here is that these promises or obligations run both ways. Your hotel is essentially listing their obligations to the guest group, and the guest group is doing likewise. Hopefully that will help you understand this next slide. What we're seeing here is a list of things that we promise or that we are obligated to do or to provide for the guest group. You may have heard the term good fences make good neighbors before. Essentially, what we want to do with our convention contract is build a good fence, one which informs both us and our guests exactly where we stand. In other words, we want to create some kind of certainty. That allows us to know what we are responsible for, as well as to calculate our operating expenses and the prices that we need to charge in order to provide those services at a profit. On the other hand, the guest is made aware of exactly what they can expect for their money. So as you can see here, we want to cover things like check-in and check-out procedures, getting guests and their luggage to the room, who's responsible for transportation, taxes, etc. The next competency is among the most important, but may require us to predict the future in some way. Now that we know what services we need to provide, we can calculate a cost or a cost per room and see how many guests we will require in order to make a contract profitable. Let me give you an oversimplified example. If we have determined that we need to make $1,000 to make this contract profitable, and we normally rent our hotel rooms for $100 per night, we can easily see that we need to rent 10 hotel rooms. 10 rooms times $100 each equals the $1,000 we need to make money. Here is where we run into our requirement to predict the future. Remember, convention contracts are sometimes negotiated for events that will happen in the future, sometimes years in the future. We know what we would have to charge per room today, but how do we know what to charge 2 or 3 years from now? Luckily, this is one of the easier parts of our job. We're going to use what's called an inflator rate. that will show us what to charge. We simply look at our rate today, and these charts or calculators help us to see what we will need to charge at the time of the event to stay profitable. The other part of the calculation, the number of guests or rooms, can be much more difficult. It's difficult because we may require the convention or group to promise or obligate themselves, think here in terms of a bilateral contract, to paying for this number of guests or rooms regardless of how many guests actually attend the event. While it is difficult for us to contract to save these rooms years in advance, it is even more difficult for the convention organizer to guarantee that they will fill these rooms years in advance. As a way to help us get over this hurdle, we're usually going to include some contractual mechanisms that help the organizer to get comfortable. First, let's talk about attrition clauses. These are clauses that give the organizer a little wiggle room. In your text, the sample attrition clause indicated that the hotel will allow for a 10% rate of attrition without penalty. So let's go back to our example in which we needed the convention to provide us with 10 rooms at $100 each night to reach our $1,000 threshold. If we had an attrition clause similar to the one in your book, we will allow the organizer to go as low as 9 rooms before we enforced any guarantee penalties. The idea here is that we are sharing the potential for fewer guests than expected with the organizer in the hopes that we can relet the room in time. The next contract mechanism we will likely use is a cancellation clause. This likely has terms that increase the penalty for cancellation the closer we get to the event date. This would allow the organizer to pull the plug without penalty as long as they did so well in advance. The closer we get to the event date, the more upfront costs we will incur in preparation, and the harder it will be for us to relet rooms that go unoccupied. Therefore, the higher the penalty will go for canceling as we approach the event date. The last contract mechanism we should talk about is a force majeure or act of God clause. This clause works for both parties and allows for a penalty-free cancellation if the reason for non-performance is outside of the breaching party's control. Let's say, for example, that a convention of doctors was scheduled to stay in downtown San Francisco. But a month before the scheduled convention, the city is hit with a major earthquake that does significant damage to the hotel, rendering it unsafe. In this case, the hotel would invoke the force majeure clause and likely be able to cancel the contract without penalty, even though they were just a month before the event, and it'd be very difficult for the doctors to find another place to go. The last major clause in a convention contract we'll discuss is the insurance clause. Insurance, as you know, is a way for the parties to calculate and protect against liability. Many convention contracts will require organizers to carry liability insurance in case someone gets hurt. This insurance can cover both the organizer and the hotel. If the organizer is using its own employees to staff the convention, they should also be required to retain workers' compensation insurance. In every case, the hotel should require that they receive a copy of the policy to ensure adequate coverages are in place. Finally, we come to the topic of review. Your text will tell you that convention contracts should be reviewed every 2 to 3 years in order to keep them current. I would suggest that you are always cognizant of changes in areas of contract and liability and review these documents as a matter of course much more often than that. That concludes our review of convention contracts and each of the competencies we outlined at the beginning of the lecture. As always, if you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me.